So yeah, welcome everyone. It's great to see you. Hi, Victoria. So Victoria and I are going to have another one of our conversations. We did our first one, I don't know, probably about 6 weeks ago, was it, Victoria?
Something like that, yeah. Early April.
And really it's just a way for Victoria and I to share some of the experiences that we've had in helping organisations, usually large organisations, using story techniques to get business things done. And the first webinar was really, and each one was we take one case study and we explore it. In the first conversation that we had, I talked about some work we did with a large bank, helping the front line to find and tell customer impact stories as a way to connect to their purpose and also to really get them to appreciate, I suppose, the amazing work that they're doing. It's to keep that motivation up and keep them excited. So that's what we mainly talked about in the first one. So because it was a case study I was bringing to the table, I probably talked way too much. And so, but this time it's Victoria's turn to bring.
Talk way too much. Yeah.
And so I'll be listening and asking questions and sort of learning along the way. So I mentioned just before the time started that we want to use our Q&A panel for all the questions. So if you write a question in the chat window, we're going to ignore you there. And our friend Sinden, who's also online, a colleague, she'll be in the chat window reminding you to go and pop your questions in the Q&A panel. So pop it up there. Now, the great thing about the Q&A panel is everyone can upvote questions. So if you see a question you really like and want answered, we can upvote that, and we'll be able to see the questions filtering to the top, and they're the ones that we'll answer first. So I think there's only one other thing I wanted to say before we get started, and that is I'll be actually coming to London on the 18th of June. Actually, I'll be there for a few days beforehand, and running a public workshop, one of our Storytelling for Leaders programs. If you'd like to attend, please just go to our website. There's an events page, and you'll sort of see the event described there. What you can do if you want a discount code for the event, just email me and I'll send you a discount code just for people who are on the webinar. So if that's of interest, let me know and we will get it all organised for you. So with that little introduction, I think I'm going to really throw it over now to Victoria to set the scene and really give us a good understanding of the case study that she's going to share with us today.
Great. Now listen, Shawn, if I go much on beyond like 15 minutes, please make some really weary hand gesture, because you'll have, or when you get bored or zone out, right? And if you need to pause me as we go because I've said something that needs to be looked into a bit or clarified, do that too. Full permission.
Okay, right. Sounds good.
So the case study that Shawn shared, there are a couple of things from last time that got me thinking, what's the right case study to share this time? And the case study that Shawn shared last time, if I remember rightly, came from a Royal Commission into banking in Australia. That's right, isn't it?
That's right, yeah.
So essentially it was kind of a governance change or a regulatory change or a kind of a change in the environment that came about as a consequence of a Royal Commission. That led to having a different kind of relationship with customers at the front line that was less transactional and more relational. I think that's kind of right.
Yeah, pretty much.
A very sort of short summary. So the case, and then the other thing that happened in the chat was a couple of people were particularly interested in two things that I mentioned, one of which was the idea of factional storytelling, which is threading together pieces of a fictional story, but all have their source in fact, what one might call fact. And the other was the role of visual storytelling. So those three things led me to choose this case study, which was one of the most successful pieces of work we've done in the last 10 years or so. And I think it started about 2010 or 2011. And I'm going to name check our team, which was in my old business Spark now, because I think that's the fair thing to do. There was me, there was Philip Gibson, there was Fiona Hiscox, there was Seb Antoniou, who was our visual person. I don't want it to be just me. It was a very multidisciplinary effort, and we might come back to why that matters later. Let me set the scene. This is also a highly regulated sector, with a regulator changing their interest in integrity and ethics and quality, upping their interest in ethics and quality and so on. But the case study is not an outward-facing one, a customer-facing one. Obviously, eventually it is, but it's about the internal culture of manufacturing on the manufacturing floor. So this is a very big manufacturer with 50 odd sites around the world, and they're in a situation where their regulator is starting to penalize people heavily if quality isn't coherent and high. So they're in a situation where they're thinking, one of the ways to do this in terms of behaviors and values on the manufacturing floor is to create confidence and a speak up culture. So even if you're a junior person, you're entitled to blow the whistle, call it out, challenge a colleague, challenge the management, even can't challenge the management in headquarters in another country. So how do you build a coherent speak up culture around the world? And they tried all the stuff that you normally try for this. So guidebooks and communications and cascades and
all those things, yes.
The whole shebang, training, learning programs, networks. And it wasn't really getting to the heart of the problem. And we'd already done quite a lot of storytelling work of one kind or another with them over the previous few years. So it was kind of a crisis buy. That is to say, they were willing to try something creative because the normal things hadn't worked, which is quite common, actually, for the way we get bought. So we reused a format we'd actually first used with Natural England around embedding a knowledge charter in the whole of the organization.
Oh, yeah.
And I'll just give you very quickly the headlines of the format and pick out the bits that are about faction and visualizing, and then tell you what happened. So the format was, we asked them for a number of what we call quality journalists around the world at different levels of seniority. And all those journalists were invited to keep a daily journal for just 5 days consecutively, ideally, where at the end of each day, they would just write a little journal note, effectively, actually into SurveyMonkey that time,
right,
on something they've noticed about quality, however trivial or tiny or apparently insignificant.
Just a question though, that when you say journalist, you don't mean like a reporter, you mean just someone in the organization who journals.
They're watching their own experience.
Right, gotcha.
Okay, so really they're story collectors, but we didn't think that was the best way to describe them.
Yeah.
Okay, quality story collectors.
Yeah.
And I think they quite like the idea of being journalists, actually.
Right. Yeah. All of a sudden they get this new job title. Yeah, good.
And we try to get people a little bit away from the most influential networks. It was the people beyond the influential networks who were just doing a job, if you know what I mean.
Right, gotcha.
Rather than the ones who normally get a voice or get a say in things. In any case, we ended up with, I don't know, 20 or 30, 40 maybe, I can't remember. Yeah. Let's say 25. And they all kept these, really it could be tiny. It wasn't actually exactly a story. It could just have been a fragment. I saw someone stick a broom in a door to keep it open.
Right.
Might be a journal entry.
Uh-huh.
And we ended up with about 150, 200 little fragments of evidence, data, whatever you want to call it, stories. And each of those journalists also had an interview with us where they could pick one of those things to tell us about in more detail. So we had quite a bunch of material.
Yeah.
And then this is very old fashioned, but we went to headquarters, stuck all of those bits of data onto little bits of card, made a matrix on a table in a boardroom, and got our sponsors, a couple of people from our sponsors, to decide what were the important patterns to either strengthen or shift.
Very good.
Because one of the dangers is that you hear the people who write well or tell well, you don't necessarily hear what the right patterns are. And we wanted it to be really on the nose about, I'm just going to get rid of my email, otherwise, well, keep doing it. And we ended up with about 15 or 20 patterns that they thought they wanted us to home in on.
Right. And these are patterns of behavior, are they? Yeah,
patterns of behavior, and each one of them evidence traced back to a story. And this is so they triaged, effectively, they triaged the data to decide where they wanted the focal points to be.
Gotcha, yep.
So we had, if you like, story starters. And that was the point at which both the factional and the visualizing kicked in.
Okay.
Together with some good script writing, really. So we took 15 or 20 starter situations that were the ones they wanted us to concentrate on. And we went back through all the data and said, where are the things people have told us or journaled that are about this situation? And mixed them all up together to create tiny little starter stories around that. You know, the broom in the door would be an interesting situation. You might also, there's a great term from Blast Theory, I think they're called, who are great design, participatory artists. They make a distinction when they're doing things between stories and stubs. So the stub is a start of a story, which I really like as a distinction.
Yeah. I like that idea.
So essentially, these are kind of stubs. And we got Seb, he's a fantastic illustrator and a lovely guy. We worked with Seb to turn these into sort of 6-panel pictures. Really easy, simple pictures to tell the story in 3, 4, 5, 6 panels, whatever it was.
Right.
So we did a lot of finding the right kind of factional story, turning it a little bit into a story, and turning that into a really simple visual, which could start a conversation. And we did that for,
And these are like cartoon strips or something like that?
Pretty much, although, yeah, they're quite, they're deliberately, how can I describe it? Just the right amount of sketch for you to imagine yourself in the situation. A tiny bit of detail, but not so much detail you get distracted by trying to read it.
Ah, gotcha. Right.
And I'll tell you why, because the package that we agreed with them we would create was to turn these into big posters. Remember, it's manufacturing floors.
Yep.
With a facilitator's guide and a way of the facilitator just choosing a bunch of people and using the poster to almost create a neutral space anywhere, in a room, on the menu, wherever, to use this as a story starter that would then allow people to feel that they could share their own stories.
Right.
And they weren't also stories that were necessarily good or bad. They could have been ambiguous. You know, they were gray areas, things that you might not always, or things that are so small, you might not think to call it out, or you might feel nervous because you're going to annoy a colleague.
Yes.
So we tried to make them, you know, you said last time how important it was the stories are small enough for people to attach themselves to them.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
They're not so big that they're big and out there, but to bring it down, crumble it down into tiny stories that are like us.
Yeah, right.
And therefore give us permission and authorize us to tell our own stories and value our own experience. And I think I said last time, one of the biggest problems in operational worlds is people have lost the confidence that their own voice counts for something, or feel their own experience is so trivial, it's not worth talking about, or don't have the space, or might feel they're going to annoy someone. So it was very much about creating this third space that would give people permission to change the nature of the conversations they had. Right. Anyway, that's pretty much, that's kind of what we did.
Yeah,
we did the pilot before it had finished. So what happened next? What happened next?
Can I just ask a question though? So when you have the, you know, sort of these graphic, if you like, you know, versions, the factional versions of the stories, did you guide the conversation, or was it just putting those posters in places where conversations are likely to happen? How did that actually unfold?
No, guided,
right.
And actually, you've asked a great question there, because the other thing we wanted to do, which is what we did also with the Natural England work and have done with other work, is make it really easy for someone who isn't a very confident facilitator to have a starting point to facilitate a different kind of conversation, which is also, and this is very countercultural, not solutions driven, not deliverables driven, not outcomes driven, but just sharing experience. Yeah. So it's you know, I'm in a solutions driven, deliverables driven, output driven world with targets. What gives me permission to invite people to slow down and just take a look at how the world works around here?
Yeah, gotcha, yeah. And do you remember a specific instance where you're guiding people through a conversation? I mean, are you able to sort of paint that picture for us so that we can get a real...
Well, I didn't do that. What happened was Philip and Fiona went and ran trial sessions with
Right.
the managers or the people on the manufacturing floors. I think they went to 2 or 3 countries.
Yes.
I think Philip even went to the US and did that. So they did that. They, if you like, shadowed the people to help them to work out what we should put in the facilitator's guide.
Yeah, right.
And we made a little video to go with it to help the facilitators just have enough material to be able to. And in the facilitator's guide, I do remember we banged on quite a lot about this is not about a solution. It's about shared experience.
Yes, yes.
So don't drive for a solution. What you're doing is slowing things down to open them out.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I
I was just thinking that my friend Jock McNeish, who's a cartoonist, but also a really amazing sort of leadership consultant, he did a project for a mining company in Western Australia. It was around safety. And he ended up he found a whole bunch of stories, but he ended up creating posters, but they were just one-frame posters. And it would be like, someone standing next to a big tractor. And then there would be a speech bubble. And there was no words in the speech bubble.
Brilliant. I like that.
So the people would new people would look at it and go, oh, so what's that about? And they'd turn to a friend, Steve, do you know what's that about? And they go, oh. And then they would prompt them to tell the story about what happened with the tractor and and just as a trigger for stories in common work, sort of where they're having their the canteens and the cafeterias and stuff like that in their workplace.
I think you're saying something really interesting there about interrupting normal routines. You're just snagging on people's imagination and interrupting their normal routines.
Yes.
And I like that idea of the empty speech bubble very much, because there's a danger of pushing too much learning stories at people. This is very pared back and sketched to make, really, the poster's almost about creating a different space of just enough to start it off.
Yes. Yeah.
And what happened was, before we'd finished piloting, they'd said, we want to translate it into 21 languages and can we have 5 more stories?
Right.
And then they were off. They were off.
Yeah.
And we called it quality conversations, because it was the idea that starting with these stories would change conversations, and then those conversations would change the stories that we can tell around here.
Yeah.
So we called it quality conversations. And what's interesting to me now is a couple of things they've gone on using it. Number one, they've gone on using it. They've stopped bothering with the posters because they now have a sort of system where they can do the same kind of thing and anyone can start with a story. So it's created the space.
Yes.
It's created the story space.
Yeah, it's given them a pattern of how to do it.
Let's have a quality conversation is kind of how they might start that kind of thing. They've also gone on really liking the idea of journaling and becoming more aware.
Yeah.
And that's actually what happened when we did it with Natural England too, as they went on using the journals and discovered that their knowledge is seasonal.
Yeah.
So, so there's that. And then the other thing I think is really important about it before I stop is, for the first bit, I'm convinced that part of the success was they knew that it had all come from them. They'd made this. We'd just created a creative process.
Yes, right.
That would translate what they knew and their experience into something they could render into a way of starting a different kind of set of conversations about quality. I think we never really tied it back to the KPIs of, are we being fined by our regulator or not?
Right.
Which I thought was a bit of a loss. And I did think at the time it was a loss not to create networks between the different sessions. But I'm not sure that's right, because actually just allowing them to take their own form, rather than having to go, well, which of these stories is useful somewhere else in a Ritz-Carlton kind of way, might have been a bit more orthodox in that kind of organization. So just letting this happen and be quite organic and take root in the organization in its own time feels, I think, at the time I was a bit cross they hadn't done that. But I think in retrospect, it probably found its own path and trickled into the places it needed to trickle into, and then took root and established itself. So. Anyway,
I think any sort of initiative where you can actually have the people own it themselves, right? It's going to have a phenomenal bigger impact than anything that's, you know, created for them. You know?
Yeah.
So I reckon it's fabulous that you're able to get them to pick it up and run with it and see it as something that it came from their own stories, and, you know, it also was very much you know, driven by their own people, their own facilitators gave them those capabilities. Now we've got a couple of questions, Victoria. How about I? Don't worry, I'll read them out for you. You can see what you think. So the one that's at the top here by Scott Mason. What works well for virtual teams? Well, this is an important one with all these global companies that are trying to really get their head around story. Yeah, the ones distributed across the globe mostly connect virtually. What's your experience with, you know, sort of collecting and sharing stories in a sort of a global environment? Is there anything that sort of springs to mind for you?
Hi, Scott. Nice to see you and see you active. It's harder, isn't it, in a way? Although this was a virtual team. If I could say, if you think about it, the collecting was done virtually by journalists who didn't know each other.
Right.
So in terms of creating the understanding and creating the shared data, in fact, in a way, the whole process was virtual because very few of these journalists and managers and stuff were in the same manufacturing site.
Yes.
And mostly they started by having a relationship with us.
Yeah.
I think the big challenge with virtual teams is having a host who understands how to make a social space virtually that has some purpose, but people, so there's something about your hosting and convening skills, and there's also something, I think, in a virtual space, which is almost a separate webinar, which I'm happy to give if anyone wants me to, but about thinking about the move between asynchronous or private work, moving out of the meeting onto the next thing. Yeah. I think you can be in a bunch of people who know each other on a manufacturing floor quite well. And you can also get away from, you can be careful to manage the victim mentality there too, I think, quite well. One of the things that happens, I think, virtually is people can feel blacker and bleaker and more inclined to get angry and vent. So there's also managing that side of emotions. Yeah. But I think virtually our best success has been seeing it as a sequence in which meeting face-to-face virtually is part of a sequence where there's an arrival and a departure and stuff happening in a sort of program way which allows you to build things up.
I remember Nancy White and Etienne Wenger, you know, did a lot of work in communities of practice. John Smith is one of the other collaborators. They talked about ramping up, you know, doing the virtual face-to-face and then ramping down as a sort of, you know, just a basic method for creating this more cohesive conversation online. But I think one of the greatest challenges that happen on a virtual front is keeping stories oral, right? And cool. What happens is that we often go, oh, we've got to type this down. We've got to write these stories, right? And I tell you what, as soon as you move into the written story versus the oral story, you actually shift and you change the types of stories that are collected. And I'm very much of the view I want to have as many oral stories. So when I collect stories using anecdote circles, I'll just collect them. You know, I'll have a few people in different offices, you know, in different locations, and I'll just facilitate it like I was facilitating it, sort of sitting in the room with them. And they tell stories just as much as anyone else in that environment. In fact, perhaps even more. I think they feel a little bit more comfortable, a little bit of distance between the facilitator and the group. So there's certainly lots of different ways of getting stories from people, you know, collecting stories, but getting them stories back out again.
No, that's a great point.
You're going to be looking at podcasts and, you know, video and things like that. So just to keep it oral, you know, keep those stories oral.
I think that's right. I think the posters were serving a slightly different purpose though as well, because they were creating safety for the facilitator and safety for the participants and a kind of third space, a neutral space. So although they looked like the starters of stories, which they were,
Yes.
They were kind of, there's a great article somewhere by a bloke, Alex Panchung, a Foresight guy, who
Right.
talks about the value of paper spaces, the role of paper spaces as actually a space of collective imagination or creativity or whatever you might want it to be. And I've taken a lot from that idea. In fact, I mean, without getting too much on a detour, I went and did some work. I've used kind of timeline interviews quite a lot, and it's fascinating when you're interviewing people in timelines. Honestly, you could put the piece of paper, one interview, the guy, I was asking him about some health work, health in crises sort of work.
Yeah.
And he held the pen over the piece of paper, the A3 piece of paper. It never touched the paper, but you could see it created for him a window to his memories.
Wow.
That, so I found different ways of thinking. Well, even the triage of the little kind of pieces of paper where the client was working out which patterns mattered. There's something
Did he
about
move the
that.
pen in different locations?
He did. He was
Yeah.
sort of moving around. And I kept thinking, please put that on the piece of paper and just put a date and an event. But somehow it got away from me. So now, and I think you can do that actually in virtual meetings, to come back to Scott's question. So we're doing a lessons learned thing at the moment.
Right.
Is there a social way of creating quick, fast lessons learned that are a bit different to more conventional methods?
Yeah.
And in fact, we got our scribe, Fernanda, for the beginning sessions for each one. We get her to scribe the storytelling as it unfolds, just visualize it.
Yes.
And help people then go back and look for the patterns in it. So we almost create this third space through using the Zoom space for the live scribing.
Right.
And that, Scott, also creates a slowing down of everyone to put them in the same landscape, to put them in the same place where they're having a conversation together. So that's another way of bringing virtual people together, is to think about how to use the ability of the video stuff and so on.
So there's a sort of a question here too. So that's Scott's question, but here's one from Nathan. He wants to know what are our favourite methods of gathering stories or stubs from large groups of people, right?
I also want to answer Kerry's question in a minute as well. Well, face-to-face or virtually, where are we going here? Large groups, you go first.
Let's go broad. Let's go broad first. Well, I'll tell you one way I've done it, which worked really well. I used a technique called jumpstart storytelling.
Yep, I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah, we were going to say the same thing.
Snap,
yeah, so,
snap, yep.
I mean, I did it was a project for actually the bushfires that happened here in Victoria. They had these terrible fires. They killed 270 people, I think, and they split the state up into 30 sort of regions that were recovery regions, if you like. But they realised about 18 months after the fire that these regions weren't learning from each other. So we got the leaders from all those regions to come into a room, and my idea was that if you wanted to connect people, you needed to get them to tell stories to one another. And so I started off with a jumpstart storytelling, which is essentially what you do is you have them all in tables. You have a question, which is a story eliciting question. The one I used was, when have you seen a small thing make a big difference? And then everyone tells a story based on that question. And then they are asked at the end of that round to just think about which story had the biggest impact for you. So once they've told the story and they've thought to themselves, okay, which story really resonates with them, they're asked to remember the person who told that story. And then I get them to move around to another table and to tell the story again, the story that they told the first time. And again, out of all the stories they've heard, I asked them to remember the story that resonated with them the most. And we might do that a third time. And then after that, you get everyone to stand up and put the hand on the shoulder of the person who had, the story that had the biggest impact. And it's this crazy conga line sort of experience for people. A lot of people laughing, they're having a good time. But what it does is it quickly shows you where the stories are which have the biggest impact. And you know what I did, Victoria? In this particular one, I borrowed your story card idea, right?
Oh, cool.
And I gave everyone a story card, because normally I would just get the person, you know, who had lots of hands on their shoulder to tell their story. But these stories were horrific. I mean, these stories were about people surviving these fires and things like that. So I actually got them to write their story on the story card, and then at the top they had to write how many hands were actually on their shoulder, right? And then we put all the story cards on the wall, and we had something like 300 or more stories, all sort of with an indication of just how impactful those stories were. So you more or less got all these people telling stories with one another, and they were instantly connected. But we ended up with 300 stories in a matter of, I don't know, probably an hour, I would say it took us to do.
Jumpstart is really economical. It was devised by Seth Khan when he was at the World Bank, wasn't it?
Seth Khan, yeah.
It's really economical. And what I just want to call out, I've used it a lot for large groups, anything over 20 people up to, I mean, I've done it for 300, 400. Yeah. You can, it's a really, really good way of, and it's got all sorts of side effects too. People learn more about storytelling. They become a community.
Yes.
It really works on multiple levels. But what I want to call out there that I think is a lovely design thought is the care with which, because these are horrific stories, you're not then going back and getting the people with the most hands to retell their stories, la-di-da-di-da, which is what you normally do. Yes. But you're working out how to find that out in a more thoughtful and gentle way. And I really like that.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of a similar thing, actually, which was sort of like a jump start to, again, for quite a large group, 60, 70 people, which was for a community of practice at the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation. And it was almost, it wasn't quite a jump start. It was a bit more like an appreciative inquiry thing. But we also had to deal with language issues there because, of course, although lots of people spoke English, French, German, Italian interchangeably, the Spanish group tended not to speak the other languages who were there. So we had 80 or 90 people there, but we had to figure out how to overcome language barriers and stuff as well, which is another consideration, is what language do you tell your story in? And that time we did a sort of thing where people had a little postcard. We said, write a little postcard story, share it with someone else, share it with 2 other people, and then pick one of those stories that you think is a really great example of a time when you felt alive in a community.
Right.
So what would a good community look and feel like from anywhere?
Yeah.
And then we ended up with, and then we could bring the translators in, the 4s going in an appreciative inquiry way and sharing their best story with each other.
Yes.
So you did that sort of pyramid thing, but it allowed us to get the translation in. Right. Because you weren't trying to simultaneously with Jumpstart, that would be difficult. And what happened with that material, which was lovely, one of them said, I've never forgotten it, a story that they felt most alive. They were at a conference at the dinner afterwards, which was outside, and it started to rain. So they pushed all the tables to one side and started dancing in the rain. So actually that sense of being alive and belonging in a community came from dancing in the rain. So then Steph, who's an anthropologist, and I were kind of taking notes and collecting the cards. And we used all those stories to create their founding, if you like, constitutional document about how do we work as a community of practice?
Yes.
What are the qualities that we bring to being a community of practice? And again, it all came from stories that they'd told when they were...
It's so lovely to take that approach, I think, because I think organisations who do similar things around the values, you know how they go through their exercises to work out, what's the values of our organisation? But then if you ask anyone to give an example of the value in action, they struggle to do it, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you come at it from the stories from the first instance, you've got experiences that are informing these ways of working, which, I think it always makes a big difference. I had this sense that, if people say they value, let's say innovation, but an organisation is not teeming with innovation stories, I would have a question mark as to whether they value innovation, right?
That's interesting. Looking at the lack of stories around themes which organisations say they have values about. I think that's
Yeah,
good.
yeah, I
There's
think,
one thing I can see Kerry's said here,
yeah.
is there bias, you know, in terms of how you name the emergent themes and analyse the stories. And I just want to pick that up because it's really
Yeah, good. Me too.
Kerry and everyone, when people were journaling, we spend a lot of time going, what are the attributes that we're interested in around these stories? And people coded their own stuff. So is this a story about a quality moment within a team? Is it a leadership moment between teams? Whatever. We created some codes for them to decide what their data meant. So when we looked at the patterns, yes, maybe there was bias, maybe there's a lack of comparison, but in the end, people's gut feels about what the stories were about were created enough patterns, you know, enough coherence in looking at the patterns. And evidently there's bias in one way, because what you're doing is you're trying to look for the stories that will help you strengthen quality, because this is about the governance of the organization.
Yeah.
And I think, though, that you kind of counteract some of the bias you might get around diversity, or whether it's a woman's story, a man's story, or a senior story, or a black story, or a white story, because really with the journaling, we were really just looking at what emerged from that, you know, their journaling and what they said about it.
Yeah.
So I think you do have to be careful, because different people do tell stories in different ways. And you have to be quite careful to be thinking about bias when you're looking at where you're going with all this stuff.
But I think, you know, by getting as much diversity in the room as you can, is probably the antidote for bias as much as you can. I think when people do these exercises, they first of all have to understand that this type of work is not analytical work. This is interpretive work. And interpretive work doesn't have the same rules in terms of, you know, for example, if someone said, do we have a representative sample size? Well, that's analytical language, right? Interpretive language doesn't work that way. You can't work out whether you've got a you know, representative sample size and, you know, those types of things. All you can do is sort of say, okay, we want the key people in the room who need to own this, who need to run with it, who need to understand some of the key patterns. What do they want to reinforce? What do they want to disrupt? And then you go with what you've got. It's a bit like that open space, you know, sort of idea of, you know, whoever's in the room are the right people, and you know, you have to run with it.
With one exception, which is you can end up with quite people who are proficient in workshopping and have got rehearsed stories.
Oh yeah,
so
right.
Firstly, the diversity thing, but the other thing is a very good technique, which I picked up a few years back, which is based on a Native American story, which is Who Speaks for Wolf. And it's to do, I mean, I can fish out the story if you like, but essentially Wolf was the non-speaking person affected by the tribe's decision to move or something like that. Right. So the wolf pack would be affected but couldn't speak for themselves. So one of the things you can do in order to make sure you're not just biased to who's in the room is also check that you're asking questions at various stages, like who speaks for Wolf, who speaks for the people who aren't here?
Yeah.
What stories would the people who aren't here tell, to make sure that you're not completely enclosed?
Yes.
So you have to be a little bit.
I think you got to be mindful of that, don't you?
Yeah.
Just as a little sidebar on, you know, sort of multi-language storytelling, I often will, you know, ask if I'm working with people from different countries and they feel more comfortable in their native language, I'll get them to do their exercises, you know, in their native language in their groups. But I don't know if you've ever had this happen, Victoria, but it's amazing how when you're listening to people speak in their native language, in this case I was in Mexico, they're all speaking Spanish, and as I was walking around the tables, I came past this table and immediately I knew they weren't telling stories, even though that was the exercise, right? To share stories around it. We're doing little anecdote circles. And I said to them, you know, asked them to, I said, why aren't you telling any stories? And they just looked at me like, how do you know that? Like how? And it's literally, you can you hear the difference. You know, when someone's telling a story, it's all sing-songy, it's up and down, and, you know, there's lots of movement. But when people are not telling stories, it's blah, 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 right?
I think that's right. And I think there's something about the quality of the tension. When people's attention is caught by a story, there's a certain stillness, isn't there?
They do. And they lean
rather
forward.
than a sort of chattery feeling.
Yeah.
So, and I wanted to just pick, Nathan said something, it's in the questions, but actually I think it's a really great comment here.
Yeah.
Because that stillness, he's saying, Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud has great advice about how to think about moments that should appear in panels of visual stories.
Yes.
And what should appear in between, the in-between spaces being filled in by the reader. Yeah. And I think that there is one of the brilliant things about finding space for storytelling is you do make everything more spacious, but richer somehow. So being willing to slow down and create space and not look for solutions does create a different quality of shared experience. Yeah. And I think that's what you're recognizing in your blah, blah, blah people who weren't telling stories, but were not following your instructions at all. Or if they were, they were just chit-chatting, weren't they?
Well, actually, there was a group of consultants from Accenture, and I think
so, okay. Well,
and I think they were analysing what was going on, right? So they were rather than telling like doing the exercise and telling the story, they were sort of talking about, I don't know, the role of storytelling.
So that's very interesting because, I mean, without detouring completely, I was playing music this weekend, which is a whole story that's, amateur music, intensely and not terribly well, but fun. But someone referred to John Cage's 12 instructions for his students at the university that he taught at.
Right.
And one of his guidelines was you cannot create and analyze at the same time.
Oh, how interesting. Right.
Yes. You have to do one and then the other.
Right.
And actually muddling the two up
is a big mistake.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah. Now, I noticed there was a question here from my friend Anne-Marie Trester. And so I thought I would read this one out. I'm struck by the ideas of slowing things down and making space for stories at a smaller scale. Can you talk about the leadership resistance? So overcoming this, reassuring them that this can actually, that this is the actual size scale that they really need. So
brilliant question,
isn't it? It's a great question.
Oh, because... on the nose. It's bloody hard work, is what I would say.
Yeah.
Shawn, do you want to say something about how you tackle that? I've got a couple of suggestions.
No, you go first. You go first.
Okay. So, Anne-Marie, such an accurately great question, because you've got this kind of dissonance. The leaders think that very often are thinking that storytelling is a convenient shortcut to getting something done. So when you say, well, actually, it's all about slowing things down, they often go, well, why? Because we need to speed things up. So you end up with this sort of friction. You do end up with quite a lot of resistance. And it takes quite a lot for leaders to understand that everything is in these small stories, these tiny things that might otherwise be overlooked, that are actually telling you a very big story.
Yeah,
if only you were to take the time to discover them and dive in.
Yeah.
And not have decided already what you're going to find out either.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's this kind of exploration. So one of the things, and I probably overdo this a bit, but that's why I do things in quite a methodological way. So treat this as, if you like, an organizational development research method has been quite successful for me. First, there's the journaling, and they code the data up. Then something else happens. Then we make these decisions. Then we make those. Because not only in the end can you then show back to the people who created it that they really made something following that method, but you also reassure leaders at different stages that there is something going on here that has some method behind it, which for many leaders in analytical organizations is quite reassuring. And you can start to show them as the data emerge how it connects to the bigger picture of the culture as well. So I think those feedback loops back to the leaders as your data unfolds, while keeping your participants quite safe, You need to often protect your participants,
Yes, that's
because
true.
leaders might get anxious about, well, are they going to tell stories on social media that are about stuff we don't want to talk about? Which is another thing about writing stories down and oral stories, is actually, what are you passing on by word of mouth and what are you passing on written down? There are also issues about what will get out into the world. When you're talking about quality or governance or compliance, there's that whole level as well. But leaders do, many leaders aren't really used to this participatory approach. So there are several ways of deflecting from that. One is to be quite methodological. One, I think probably, Shawn, you're just a lot more persuasive than I, with the big, with the head honchos, in persuading them to give it a go. But I tend to come from that. I'm a researcher end of things. Yeah.
I guess the approach I take is I kind of, well, I don't really lead strongly with story, in the sense of, hey guys, we're going to do this storytelling thing. I find that scares leaders off a little bit. So I'll say things like, so one of the key things we're going to be doing today is sharing experiences, and leaders really know that experiences are very, very important, and actually very numbers-based people like engineers and scientists and stuff like that, they also know that experiences are important, and it's important to understand each other's experiences. And of course, what you're doing, you're actually sharing stories. But it goes back to my, I suppose, never use the S word type approach to storytelling. I mean, clearly there are people who are involved in the design and, who, sort of taking the organisation through this process has to understand the idea of story and what it means. And you get more explicit about it as they get a bit more comfortable with it, but you almost want to give them an experience of it first, so that they go, oh, actually this works really well, and we get lots of value from this, and then you can sort of say, oh, by the way, that's storytelling.
I think you're right. Throwing people into the experience and then just naming it afterwards is a really good tactic.
Yes. Yeah.
And I just want to pick up in relation to that, though. There's quite a lot of deceptively simple art in this. Stephen Lee, although it hasn't been upvoted, asks how much success is dependent on the leader's ability. Oh, no, not that one. How much pre-instruction is needed before starting something like a jumpstart? And in some ways, they're quite easy to run, and they're widely known. Actually, the delicate thing is to get the starting question right.
Yes.
And Sailor Picar's very good on this as well, and you're good on this. But actually, so someone asked me recently, they were doing a year-end evaluation thing for about 30 people or something, and rang me up and said, can you give me help with the starting question here? The boss wants to know what they've learned this year, wants to evaluate. And I said, that's not really going to work, because then people are having to put their learning on show with each other in this jumpstart, which feels like you're judging them for the quality of their learning. What about a question like, what delighted you this year? What was a moment of delight for you when you really saw the benefit of your learning or something? So by shifting it to the emotion word,
makes all the difference.
Actually, you can spend a lot of time. I mean, I've spent like an hour with Sailor finding one question, or an hour with you finding exactly the right way in. So the actual mechanics of a jumpstart are perfectly simple and worth giving a go. But the art is in working out which question is going to yield those magic moments that everyone resonates with.
And you can make a mistake in here. One of my biggest mistakes I made with the Jumpstart is I did one for a large corporation. Would have had about maybe 150 people or so in the room. And I used just that same question of when a small thing made a big difference. And I went through the process, and at the end, there was all these hands on this woman's shoulder. She had about 15 hands. And so I sort of said to her, oh, would you like to share your story? And she went, I didn't realize I would have to sort of tell. And I said, no, it's okay. That's all right. You don't have to share your story. And she just went, no, I'll do it. And then she said she fairly recently discovered she was pregnant. She wasn't married. Her boyfriend didn't want to have the baby. Her parents were very conservative Christians, and so she was almost like forced into a situation where she was going to have an abortion, right?
Wow, that's very heavy stuff. Oof.
Well, I'll tell you. And then so she starts to on the day of this whole event, she decides to walk, and as she's walking along, she's through Sydney, and for some reason she decides just to stop, and she can feel the sun on her body, and she's feeling how lovely that is, and then she realised she'd stopped in front of a childcare centre, and she can hear the voices of all the kids, and she said at that point she turned home, she didn't go to the procedure, and now she has a 2-year-old son called Trevor or something like that. And I thought, oh my God, I created a situation where this woman kind of felt pressured into telling a story that she would not normally tell to a group of 150 people of her colleagues, right? And it really struck me, this has happened, I don't know, probably 6 years ago, or even longer, 10 years ago. And it just made me think, you really have to act as the steward. And it comes back to this safety issue. How do you create safety in those situations?
That's why your firefighters were so good, Shawn.
Yes, I think that happened afterwards.
Okay, so you probably learned from it, but you also create a funny imbalance there. There are these issues where that story is so deep and profound.
Yeah.
But it's a personal story.
Yes.
And the art is, what are the stories that are on the bridge between personal and professional, between personal and organizational? Because the personal stories totally matter for you in your life.
Yeah.
But if you're doing this as part of an without being too commercial and capitalist about it, which, as you probably know, I'm not very, you've got to find this balance between the personal and the professional so that you end up with sort of professional resources. These are stories about running a business.
Yeah.
Stories about and these are stories that need to work systemically in the whole business. Now, her story might work for other women needing support.
That's right. In a different context, these are
really important. And they're really important to respect them too. You can't not then acknowledge that. So there's some very important things about acknowledging people's vulnerability if they're going to put their stories out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
As well. So you've touched on a really important theme.
Yeah, so I now don't ask that question in organisations, just, when has a small thing made a big difference? I typically will say, where has a small thing made a big difference at work?
Great.
And it just scopes it down.
Well, you're reminding me. You're reminding me of a jump start went wrong. I'll just give you one other jump start went wrong that we had to adjust, and then we're probably out of time. So we were doing a lot of work around the merger between customs and excise, revenue and customs, ages ago, about 2005. And we started our workshops. It doesn't really matter what the details were. I can send people if they're interested. But we started with a question when was a moment that you were really proud to be part of this organization? Great jumpstart question under certain circumstances. Not when you've got a merger, because then people say, well, 30 years ago when we were just customs, 25 years ago. So after the first time we'd run it, the next workshop, we said, when was a time in the last 3 months that you were really proud to be part of this organization?
Right.
You really got caught out by these rose-tinted spectacles,
Just shows you how powerful they are, though, isn't it?
It's all about, and things have changed, and it's not the same as it used to be. And so, of course, we created this massive regret.
Oh, classic. Yeah. That's great.
So many ways to mess it up, right?
Oh, there is, but that's the great fun of it. Now, I notice we have quite a few other questions here. Maybe we should see if we can just grab a couple of others.
Do you think it's 5? I'm just going to check. It's 5 to 10 here. Are you very strict on your hour, or are you happy to go on for a bit?
No, we should finish it on the hour. So we've got 4 minutes to wrap things up. Maybe it would be good just to, from your case study, Victoria, I mean, in terms of that project, I could see it was a fabulous project. I mean, what would be one or two of the lessons that you learnt out of it?
Never shortchange the gathering process, even when the client is rushing you.
Yeah.
Or and make sure that a really wide range of people get to have their say and have their voice heard, because it's so important for picking up later.
Yeah.
And for getting enough quality data that you can, or if you can call it data, story data, that you're not missing a trick, or you're not just listening to the louder voices. So take your time, even if it means you're having to do little steps where you look as though you're presenting back, but take your time to gather their thoughts, gather their stories, gather their experiences. I think the other thing is make sure that the client participates in choosing what's coming out of that. Again, it's sort of unblackboxing it, because if we had made a decision what mattered, we would have been jumping to conclusions and making assumptions.
Yes.
So I think having those iteration loops where different participants get their say, and really you're guiding a facility, you know. Oh, and the third thing is a multidisciplinary team. I know my knowledge management. I'm a great designer. I've done a lot of story work. So does Fiona. Philip is a very economical writer, and he's very clear and direct and clear and demanding about clarity.
Yes.
Seb is a great illustrator. You know, you need that mix of people in the team, I think, to make sure you're not just going with one person's preferred way, but that you're using the different disciplines at different stages for gathering, making sense of, translating into products that will go on and do some work.
Yeah.
So that would be, those would be things that I come back to.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think you're right. And it certainly, I know, as you say those things, it certainly has a lot of resonance in my experience as well. So that's fabulous. Well,
can I ask you one question before we close, though?
Yeah.
Do you think we should go through these questions afterwards sometime next week? And if there's anything obvious, maybe just...
Yeah, we can send a message out to people and put something out to people. That'd be great.
Cool.
Well, guys, I think we'll wrap things up. It's been fabulous as always. It's thanks very much, Victoria. I so much enjoy having these conversations.
Me too.
And yeah, if people want to email us or have any questions, they want to follow up with us, please send us a note. And if you want to come along to our public workshop that we're running in June, I'd love to see you. Well, that's really very much on, you know, building the habit of storytelling, you know, how to build the story. How do you do that? So,
and just to clarify, there are only 2 more of these. We agreed to do 4.
Yeah, we're doing 4 in the
like
series.
1 in July and 1 in September, and then that's kind of like the whole thing. So,
that's the series. Yeah.
And it's Shawn's turn.
Guys. We'll see you soon. Bye for now.
Thank you.